The morning air in Poplar, Wisconsin, carried the familiar scent of freshly turned earth and pine. It was a small farming community, population 300, where everyone knew everyone, and the rhythm of life moved with the seasons. In this quiet corner of America, a boy named Richard Ira Bong looked up from his chores, watching a mail plane cut across the brilliant blue sky above his family's farm. The year was 1928, and that simple moment would change everything. Years later, when asked what made him want to become a pilot, Major Richard Bong would recall those mail planes with perfect clarity. They flew right over his house, carrying letters to President Calvin Coolidge's summer residence in nearby Superior. For young Dick, those aircraft represented something beyond the boundaries of farm life, beyond the endless rows of crops and the daily routine of feeding livestock. They represented freedom, possibility, and adventure. But on that autumn morning in 1928, as the 8-year-old boy stood in the field with dirt under his fingernails, no one could have imagined that this farm boy would one day become the most feared American pilot in the Pacific, the man who would shoot down 40 enemy aircraft, break Eddie Rickenbacker's legendary record, and perform aerial maneuvers so audacious that they would become the stuff of legend among fighter pilots for generations to come. This is the story of how a quiet, humble farm boy from Wisconsin became America's ace of aces, and how his impossible tricks in the sky would inspire courage, awe, and respect throughout the Allied forces in the Pacific theater of World War II. The Seeds of a Dream. Richard Ira Bong was born on September 24, 1920, the eldest of 9 children. His father, Carl, had immigrated to America from Sweden as a young boy, bringing with him the Swedish values of hard work, humility, and perseverance. His mother, Dora Bryce, was American-born, of Scottish, English, and Irish descent. Together they built a life on their small farm just west of Poplar, instilling in their children the importance of family, responsibility, and integrity. The Bong family could have stepped out of a Norman Rockwell painting. Young Dick learned to operate farm machinery almost as soon as he could walk, working alongside his father and siblings to keep the farm running. But even as his hands worked the soil, his eyes remained fixed on the sky. Every time a plane passed overhead, work would pause, if only for a moment, as Dick tracked its path across the heavens. The boy who would become America's greatest fighter ace was not naturally outgoing or aggressive. His classmates and teachers at Poplar High School remembered him as quiet, almost invisible in a crowd. He wasn't the type to seek attention or boast about his abilities. Instead, Dick Bong was methodical, focused, and intensely curious about how things worked. He excelled at understanding machinery, a skill honed on the farm that would later prove invaluable in the cockpit of sophisticated fighter aircraft. But Dick was no recluse. He played clarinet in the school band, filling the autumn Friday nights with music at football games. He competed on the baseball, basketball, and hockey teams, though he was never the star player. He sang in the church choir on Sundays, his voice blending with those of his neighbors. In his spare time, he hunted and fished in the pristine north woods of Wisconsin, developing an uncanny eye for movement and distance, skills that would serve him well in aerial combat. And through it all, Dick built model airplanes. His bedroom was filled with them, hanging from the ceiling on strings, each one carefully constructed and painted. He devoured every aviation magazine he could find, memorizing the specifications of different aircraft, studying the careers of famous pilots like Charles Lindbergh, who had grown up just across the state line in Minnesota. For Dick Bong, aviation wasn't just a hobby. It was a calling. When Dick transferred to Central High School in Superior for his senior year in 1938, he was already making plans. That same year, he enrolled at Superior State Teachers College, but his heart wasn't in teaching. His heart was in the sky. In 1938, the college offered something revolutionary, the Civilian Pilot Training Program. It was designed to prepare men for roles in civilian aviation, but everyone understood its true purpose. War clouds were gathering over Europe and Asia. America would need pilots, and soon. Dick Bong threw himself into the program with characteristic determination. He also took private flying lessons, spending money he earned from odd jobs to get more time in the air. His instructors immediately recognized something special. Dick had natural talent, an instinctive feel for how an aircraft moved through the air, how it responded to control inputs, how to coax maximum performance from the machine. But more than that, he had patience. He didn't rush. He didn't take unnecessary risks. He learned every system, understood every limitation, and only then did he push boundaries. On May 29, 1941, with war looming ever closer, Dick Bong made the decision that would define his life. He enlisted in the Army Air Corps Aviation Cadet Program. At 20 years old, the farm boy from Poplar, Wisconsin, was about to begin the journey that would make him a legend. Learning to fly, learning to fight. Dick Bong's path through flight training was marked by steady, consistent excellence. He completed his primary training at Rankin Aeronautical Academy in California in June 1941, then moved on to basic training at Gardner Field. But it was at Luke Field near Phoenix, Arizona, that Dick truly began to shine. Luke Field specialized in advanced training for single-engine fighters, and it was here that Dick mastered the 8.6 Texan, the tough, reliable trainer that prepared thousands of American pilots for combat. One P-38 Czech pilot who flew with Dick during this period would later say he was the finest natural pilot he had ever met. Even in the slow, underpowered AT-6, there was no way the instructor could keep Dick from getting on his tail during practice dogfights. The farm boy had found his element. On January 19, 1942, just 6 weeks after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Second Lieutenant Richard Bong received his commission and his pilot's wings. America was now at war, and the demand for pilots was desperate. But instead of being shipped immediately overseas, Dick was kept at Luke Field as a gunnery instructor. His superiors recognized that his natural abilities could help train other pilots, and for the first few months of 1942, Dick taught aerial gunnery tactics, all while yearning for his chance to get into the fight. That chance came in May 1942 when Dick received orders to transfer to Hamilton Field near San Francisco, California. He was being assigned to the 49th Fighter Squadron, 14th Fighter Group, and he would be flying the aircraft that would become synonymous with his name, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. The P-38 was unlike any fighter the world had ever seen. With its distinctive twin-boom design, twin Allison engines, and central nacelle containing the cockpit and armament, the Lightning looked like something from a science fiction story. It was fast, capable of speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour in level flight. It had range, able to fly missions twice as long as other American fighters. And it was deadly, with 450 caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon, all mounted in the nose, delivering a concentrated stream of firepower that could tear an enemy aircraft apart. For Dick Bong, the P-38 was love at first flight. The twin engines gave him confidence, especially for long missions over water where engine failure in a single-engine fighter meant almost certain loss. The aircraft's unique design meant it had quirks and limitations, but Dick studied them all, learning to work with the Lightning rather than against it. He understood that the P-38 couldn't turn as tightly as Japanese fighters at low speeds, but it was faster in straight-line flight and had a superior climb rate. Energy tactics, not turning fights, would be the key to success. But understanding the aircraft's capabilities was one thing. Pushing those capabilities to their absolute limit was another. And it was at Hamilton Field that Dick Bong began to earn his reputation for performing the impossible. The Impossible Tricks, San Francisco, in the summer of 1942, was a city transformed by war. The harbor bustled with naval vessels. Defense workers flooded into factories working around the clock, and overhead, the distinctive twin booms of P-38 Lightnings became a common sight as pilots from Hamilton Field practiced their combat maneuvers over the bay. But one pilot began to stand out, not just for his skill, but for his audacity. Dick Bong, the quiet farm boy from Wisconsin, seemed to become a different person when he strapped into the cockpit of his P-38. The introvert became fearless. The careful, methodical young man became unpredictable and intuitive. It was as if the aircraft unlocked something wild in him, something that had been constrained by years of farm discipline and small-town propriety. On June 12, 1942, Dick Bong pulled off a stunt that would become legendary among Bay Area residents. A fellow pilot had just gotten married, and to celebrate, Dick decided to give the newlyweds a very special wedding present. He took his P-38 down to treetop level and buzzed the couple's house in nearby San Anselmo, the roar of twin Allison engines rattling windows and sending the bride's heart racing as the massive fighter thundered past, so close she could see Dick grinning and waving from the cockpit. But Dick wasn't finished. He took his Lightning into San Francisco proper, dropping down to rooftop level along Market Street, one of the city's main thoroughfares. Office workers looked up in shock to see a fighter plane screaming past their windows. Dick waved to secretaries who stood frozen at their desks, mouths open in astonishment. The wake of his passage set papers flying and sent pedestrians diving for cover. Then came the most audacious maneuver of all. Dick lined up on the iconic Golden Gate Bridge, that magnificent span of international orange steel that had opened just 5 years earlier. He approached from the south, dropping lower and lower, until he was below the level of the roadway. Then, with absolute precision, he flew under the bridge, the twin booms of his Lightning passing through the narrow space between the water and the underside of the span. But Dick wasn't the only one performing these stunts. On that same day, several other P-38 pilots from Hamilton Field attempted to loop around the Golden Gate Bridge, flying a complete vertical circle around the bridge's center span. It was breathtaking, it was dangerous, and it was absolutely against regulations. The final straw came when Dick flew so low over Oakland that his prop wash blew wet laundry off a housewife's clothesline, sending her clean sheets tumbling into the dirt. The woman was furious and immediately called Hamilton Field to file a complaint. The call went straight to the commanding officer, Major General George C. Kenney. General Kenney was not amused. On Monday morning, Second Lieutenant Richard Bong stood at attention in the general's office, expecting to be court-martialed or at minimum discharged from the service. The general's face was stern as he delivered his punishment. "Lieutenant Bong," Kenney said, his voice hard, "you will check out this address in Oakland. If that woman has any washing to be hung out on the line, you will do it for her, and then you will mow her lawn." Dick did as ordered, spending an afternoon doing chores for the irate housewife, apologizing profusely for his recklessness. It was humiliating, embarrassing, and should have been the end of his flying career. But something unexpected happened. General Kenney, despite his stern public rebuke, was privately impressed. The general had been a combat pilot himself in World War I. He understood that the aggressive, fearless attitude Dick displayed, while inappropriate over San Francisco, was exactly what was needed over the jungles of New Guinea and the islands of the Pacific. The ability to push an aircraft to its absolute limits, to fly it with absolute confidence in situations where lesser pilots would hesitate, that was the difference between aces and casualties. General Kenney was being assigned to command the 5th Air Force in the Pacific Theater. He needed pilots who could fly, fight, and win against the formidable Japanese Zero fighters that had dominated the skies since Pearl Harbor. He needed pilots who understood their aircraft so intimately that they could make it do things that seemed impossible. He needed pilots like Dick Bong. Instead of ending Dick's career, the clothesline incident launched it. In September 1942, General Kenny personally selected Dick Bong as one of 50 P-38 pilots being sent to the Pacific Theater. The quiet farm boy was going to war, into the crucible. The journey to the Pacific was long and sobering. Dick and his fellow pilots island hopped across the Pacific, watching the vast blue expanse of ocean roll endlessly beneath their wings. They saw the devastation at Pearl Harbor, the twisted wreckage of battleships still visible in the harbor. They heard stories from veterans of the early fighting, tales of overwhelming Japanese air superiority, of Zeros that could outturn any American fighter, of bomber crews being torn apart by enemy fighters while their escorts could do nothing to help. By the time Dick arrived in Australia in September 1942, the Pacific War was going badly for the Allies. The Japanese had conquered the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and much of New Guinea. They had destroyed the American Asiatic fleet, had driven General Douglas MacArthur from the Philippines, and seemed unstoppable. In the air, the Mitsubishi A6M0 reigned supreme, its combination of maneuverability, range, and firepower making it the most feared fighter in the Pacific. Dick was assigned to the 49th Fighter Group, nicknamed the Flying Knights, which was based in Darwin, Australia. But there was a problem. The P-38s that the group was supposed to fly had not yet arrived. The precious Lightning fighters were in short supply, and every available aircraft was being rushed to combat zones. So while they waited, Dick and several other new pilots were temporarily assigned to the 39th Fighter Squadron, 35th Fighter Group, based at Loloki Airfield near Port Moresby, New Guinea. It was there that Dick Bong met the man who would become his mentor, friend, and the pilot who would shape his approach to aerial combat, Captain Thomas J. Lynch. Tommy Lynch was from Pennsylvania, a cool-headed, technically minded tactician who had already scored 3 victories flying the P-39 Airacobra earlier that year. Lynch wasn't flashy, but he was effective, and he understood something crucial. In the Pacific, teamwork and discipline mattered more than individual heroics. Lynch took Dick under his wing, teaching him the realities of combat that no training program could convey. He explained how the Zero's incredible maneuverability made traditional dogfighting suicidal for American pilots. He demonstrated energy tactics using speed and altitude advantage to make quick passes at enemy aircraft, firing a burst, then using superior speed to escape before the Zero could turn to engage. He emphasized the importance of staying with your wingman, of never abandoning the formation to go hunting alone. And perhaps most importantly, Lynch taught Dick patience. The temptation in combat was to rush, to take the first shot opportunity, to chase kills aggressively. But Lynch showed Dick that the patient pilot, the one who waited for the perfect setup, who took the time to position his aircraft correctly, was the pilot who survived and succeeded. Dick absorbed these lessons like a sponge, his natural intelligence and farm-bred patience making him the ideal student. He flew practice missions, learned the terrain of New Guinea with its towering mountains and dense jungles, studied the patterns of Japanese air operations, and waited for his chance. That chance came on December 27, 1942, during the desperate Battle of Bunagona. The Japanese had established strong positions along the northern coast of New Guinea, and Allied forces were struggling to dislodge them. The air battle was fierce and constant, with both sides throwing everything they had into the fight. On that morning, Captain Lynch led 12 P-38s on a patrol near Buna. The weather was typical for New Guinea, hot, humid, with towering cumulus clouds that could hide an entire squadron of enemy aircraft. At around 10,000 feet, the American formation spotted enemy aircraft below, a mix of dive bombers and their fighter escorts, approximately 40 Japanese aircraft in total. Lynch's voice came over the radio, calm and professional. "Okay, boys, here we go. Stay together, watch your six, and don't get greedy." The P-38s rolled into their attack dive, accelerating rapidly as they plunged toward the unsuspecting Japanese formation. Dick was flying as Lynch's wingman, his eyes darting between his gun sight and the sky around him, watching for threats. The Japanese spotted them at the last moment. The dive bombers, vulnerable Aichi D-3 avals, tried to jettison their bombs and scatter, but it was too late. The American fighters tore into the formation, the concentrated firepower of their nose-mounted guns devastating against the lightly armored Japanese aircraft. Dick lined up on one of the Val dive bombers, centering it in his gun sight. His training took over. Steady pressure on the trigger. Short burst. Watch the tracers. The Val's engine erupted in flames and black smoke. The bomber rolled over and plummeted toward the jungle below. First victory. But there was no time to celebrate. A Zero had seen Lynch getting into position on another target and was diving to intercept. Dick saw the danger immediately. He rolled hard, pulling his P-38 into a steep turn that pushed him back into his seat with crushing force. The Zero pilot, focused on Lynch, didn't see Dick coming. Dick fired from 300 yards, a long shot. But his bullets found their mark. The Zero's wing exploded in a spray of metal and fabric. The Japanese fighter spun away out of control, falling toward the treetops thousands of feet below. Second victory. But now Dick was in trouble. 3 more Zeros had seen him and were converging on his position. Lynch's lessons echoed in his mind. Don't try to turn with them, use your speed. Dick pushed the throttles forward and dove, the P-38 accelerating rapidly. The Zeros followed, firing, their tracers flashing past Dick's canopy. Dick dropped lower and lower, the jungle rushing up to meet him at terrifying speed. At the last possible moment, he pulled back on the stick, hauling the P-38 out of its dive, mere feet above the trees. The Zeros, lighter and more maneuverable, but unable to match the Lightning's dive speed, had to break off or risk crashing. As Dick would later describe it, he pulled out 2 inches above the shortest tree in Buna. As he leveled off, barely above the jungle canopy, Dick spotted another Val dive bomber pulling out of its attack run. It was right in front of him, perfectly positioned, traveling slowly. Dick squeezed the trigger, and the Val disintegrated in a ball of flame. Dick turned for home, his hands shaking slightly from adrenaline, his mind replaying every moment of the engagement. He had just experienced his first aerial combat, had brought down his first enemy aircraft, and had survived situations that would have ended many pilots. When he landed at Port Moresby and climbed out of his cockpit, Tommy Lynch was waiting with a broad grin. "Nice work, Dick," Lynch said, shaking his hand. "2 confirmed. That's a hell of a start." For his actions that day, Second Lieutenant Richard Bong was awarded the Silver Star, and the 39th Fighter Squadron claimed 12 total victories, a devastating blow to the Japanese. But more importantly, Dick Bong had proven to himself and others that he could fight. The farm boy had become a combat pilot. Rising Star, the new year of 1943, brought new challenges and opportunities. In January, Dick rejoined his original unit, the 9th Fighter Squadron of the 49th Fighter Group, which had finally received its P-38 Lightnings. The squadron was based at Schwimmer Field near Port Moresby, and the tempo of operations was intense. Every day brought new missions, bomber escorts, fighter sweeps, ground attack missions, reconnaissance patrols. Dick threw himself into the work with characteristic intensity. On January 7th, he was part of an 8-plane formation led by Tommy Lynch that intercepted a Japanese convoy bringing reinforcements to Leh. The convoy was heavily defended by fighters from the Japanese 11th Sentai, including the nimble Ki-43 Oscar. The ensuing air battle was chaotic and violent, swirling dogfights across miles of ocean and jungle. Dick brought down 2 Oscars that day, using the tactics Lynch had taught him. Approach from altitude, make a high-speed pass, fire a concentrated burst, then use superior speed to escape before the enemy could react. The convoy was severely damaged, its escorts decimated, and Dick's kill count rose to 4. The next day, January 8th, Dick and 7 other P-38 pilots were escorting bombers to Leh when they encountered approximately 20 Japanese fighters. The enemy had numerical superiority and the advantage of position, attacking from above. But Dick and his squadron mates fought back fiercely, their P-38's superior firepower and ruggedness making the difference. Dick brought down another enemy fighter during the swirling melee, making him an ace with 5 confirmed victories, just 2 weeks after his first combat mission. For his actions on January 8th, Dick received the Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation noted his skill in bringing down an enemy fighter with a long burst from 200 yards, a difficult shot that demonstrated his growing mastery of aerial gunnery. Dick was becoming known throughout the 5th Air Force as a pilot to watch, someone special. But if anyone expected Dick to become cocky or overconfident, they were disappointed. The farm boy from Wisconsin remained quiet, almost shy, on the ground. He didn't brag about his victories or seek attention. When fellow pilots asked him about his success, he would shrug and say something modest like, "I just got lucky. The enemy happened to be in the wrong place." Yucks. Yet in the air, Dick Bong was transforming into something remarkable. The cautious, methodical approach he brought from the farm, combined with the wild, fearless attitude he displayed in the cockpit, created a pilot who was both aggressive and smart, bold yet calculated. He would take risks that seemed insane, flying maneuvers that other pilots thought impossible, but he always did so with a clear understanding of his aircraft's capabilities and limitations. One particular incident in July of 1943 demonstrated this perfectly. Dick and 9 other P-38 pilots encountered a formation of 20 Japanese aircraft over Leh. Despite being outnumbered 2-1, Dick led the attack, his lightning diving from altitude with guns blazing. Within the first pass, he had brought down 2 enemy fighters. Then, as the American formation was reforming, 15 more Japanese fighters arrived as reinforcements. Now the odds were 35-10, heavily in the enemy's favor. Most commanders would have ordered a retreat at this point, but Dick saw an opportunity. The newly arrived Japanese fighters were still getting into position, still organizing themselves. For a brief moment, they were vulnerable. "Follow me," Dick's voice came over the radio, calm and confident. He rolled his P-38 and dove into the mass of enemy aircraft, his wingman following faithfully. The audacity of the attack surprised the Japanese pilots. Dick brought down 2 more fighters in quick succession, his accurate gunnery and aggressive flying creating chaos in the enemy formation. The other P-38 pilots, inspired by Dick's courage, pressed their own attacks. When the dust settled and both sides broke off the engagement, the Americans had brought down 11 Japanese aircraft without losing a single P-38. Dick personally accounted for 4 of those victories and was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest decoration for valor. In August 1943, Dick was promoted to captain. By now, he had become one of the most successful fighter pilots in the Pacific Theater, his victory count rising steadily with each mission. But success in combat came with its own burden. Dick watched friends and squadron mates get shot down, saw good pilots make one small mistake and pay with their lives. The tropical paradise of the Pacific Islands was beautiful, but it was also a graveyard littered with the wreckage of aircraft and the graves of young men who would never go home. Love and War. In late November 1943, Captain Dick Bong received orders that every combat pilot dreamed of. He was being sent home on leave. After more than a year of constant combat operations, flying hundreds of missions and logging over 500 combat hours, Dick was exhausted. The physical toll of aerial combat, the constant stress, the tropical diseases that swept through the squadrons, all had taken their toll. Dick had lost weight, his face had become gaunt, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. But more than rest, Dick was being sent home for public relations purposes. With 21 confirmed victories, he was now the top-scoring American ace in the Pacific, and General Kinney wanted to use Dick's success to boost morale on the home front. So Dick found himself on a transport plane heading east, island-hopping back across the Pacific, watching the combat zones fall away behind him until finally, weeks later, he landed in California, then caught a train to Wisconsin. The homecoming was overwhelming. Dick Bong, the quiet farm boy who had left Wisconsin 18 months earlier, returned as a national hero. The press mobbed him. Parades were held in his honor. He was asked to give speeches, to launch ships, to smile for cameras, to sign autographs. A group of female shipyard workers in Superior, the Welderettes as they were called, even declared him their #1 pinup boy. Dick hated every minute of it. He wasn't comfortable with fame or public attention. When reporters asked him to explain his success, he would give modest, almost dismissive answers. "Oh, I'm just lucky, I guess," he would say with a shrug. "A lot of Japanese happen to get in my way, and I keep shooting plenty of lead, and finally some of them get hit." But there was one event during his leave that Dick didn't hate. On a cold December evening, he attended a homecoming dance at Superior State Teachers College, his old school. The gymnasium was decorated with streamers and lights, a live band played popular tunes, and young people danced and laughed, temporarily forgetting about the war that had consumed the world. And there, standing near the refreshment table, Dick saw her. Marjorie Ann Vattendahl, known to friends as Marge, was a student at the college, a pretty young woman with dark hair and warm eyes. She had been elected homecoming queen and wore a crown and sash for the occasion. Dick, never particularly confident around women, found himself walking over to her almost without thinking. They talked for hours that night. Marge was intelligent, kind, and had a way of putting Dick at ease that he had rarely experienced. She didn't ask about his victories or combat experiences. Instead, she asked about his family, his childhood on the farm, his dreams for after the war. And Dick, for the first time in months, felt like himself again, not Captain Bong the ace pilot, but just Dick, the farm boy from Poplar. They began dating, and the weeks of Dick's leave flew by in a blur of dinners, movies, and long walks in the snow-covered woods of northern Wisconsin. Dick fell in love, deeply and completely. And when his leave ended in early January 1944, when he received orders to return to the Pacific, he made Marge a promise. "I'll come back," he told her, holding her hands in his. "When this war is over, I'll come back, and we'll get married and start a family. I promise." Marge, tears streaming down her face, nodded. "I'll wait for you, Dick, no matter how long it takes." Dick boarded the transport plane that would take him back to the Pacific Theater, back to combat, back to the daily dance with mortality. But now he had something he hadn't had before, a reason beyond duty and patriotism to survive. He had someone waiting for him. When Dick rejoined his squadron in New Guinea in late January 1944, he immediately went to his ground crew with a request. He wanted his P-38, a brand-new aircraft with a gleaming bare-metal finish, decorated, not with the typical nose art of scantily-clad pin-up girls that adorned many American fighters. No, Dick wanted something different. He gave his crew chief a photograph of Marge, her face radiant with a warm smile. "Paint her on the nose," Dick said, "and name the plane Marge." The ground crew went to work, and within days, Dick's P-38 bore a large portrait of Marjorie Vattendahl on its nose. Marge became Dick's constant companion in the sky, her painted face the last thing many Japanese pilots saw before Dick's guns sent them tumbling from the sky. Dick's new assignment was as Assistant Operations Officer at Headquarters, 5 Fighter Command. Officially, he was in charge of managing replacement aircraft and was no longer required to fly combat missions. But General Kinney, knowing Dick's value as a combat pilot, gave him permission to continue flying missions, though with the understanding that he shouldn't actively seek combat. Dick interpreted these orders loosely. Over the next 4 months, from January to April 1944, he flew dozens of missions, and his victory count continued to climb steadily. 22, 23, 25. Each number represented a Japanese aircraft brought down, a threat eliminated, a small contribution toward winning the war and going home to Marge. By early April, Dick had 25 confirmed victories, just one short of the legendary Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record of 26. Rickenbacker was an American icon, the top-scoring American ace of the First World War, and his record had stood unchallenged for more than 20 years. The prospect of Dick breaking that record generated enormous interest back in the United States. Newspapers began covering his progress, counting down to the historic moment. On April 12, 1944, Dick was flying a mission near Hollandia, New Guinea, when he spotted a formation of Japanese aircraft. His P-38, Marge's image gleaming on the nose, climbed into position. Dick's approach was textbook perfect. Altitude advantage, sun at his back, a high-speed diving attack that gave the enemy no warning. His first burst brought down a Japanese fighter, number 26, tying Rickenbacker's record. Dick pulled up, looking around for threats, and spotted another enemy fighter attempting to escape. He pursued, closed to optimal range, and fired. The Japanese aircraft exploded in mid-air. Number 27. Dick Bong had just become the highest-scoring American fighter ace in history. When Dick landed back at base, he found General Kenny waiting for him, along with a crowd of other pilots, ground crew, and staff officers. Everyone was cheering, celebrating this historic achievement. Kenny promoted Dick to major on the spot and immediately ordered him back to the United States for another round of leave and public relations work. Eddie Rickenbacker himself sent a telegram to Dick. "Just received the good news that you are the first one to break my record in World War I by bringing down 27 planes in combat, as well as your promotion, so justly deserved. Congratulations and happy landings always." The final missions Major Dick Bong's second trip home was even more overwhelming than the first. He was now not just a successful fighter pilot, but a genuine American hero, the man who had broken a record that many thought would stand forever. He toured training bases, showing new pilots his P-38 and sharing lessons from combat. He went on a 15-state war bond promotion tour, helping to raise millions of dollars for the war effort. Everywhere he went, crowds gathered, reporters followed, and cameras flashed. Through it all, Dick remained humble and uncomfortable with the attention. What he really wanted was to see Marge, to spend quiet time with the woman he loved, away from crowds and cameras and speeches. They managed to steal away for weekends together, making plans for their future, dreaming of the peaceful life they would build when the war finally ended. But in September 1944, duty called again. Dick was ordered back to the Pacific, this time assigned to V Fighter Command Staff as an advanced gunnery instructor. His official role was to teach other pilots how to shoot more effectively, sharing the techniques that had made him so successful. But once again, General Kenny gave Dick permission to continue flying combat missions. Dick returned to find the war had moved westward. American forces were now fighting in the Philippines, pushing ever closer to Japan itself. The Japanese were fighting with desperate ferocity, throwing everything they had into the defense of every island. The air battles were intense and costly for both sides. Dick flew from Tacloban on Leyte Island, continuing to rack up victories, 28, 30, 35. Each mission was dangerous, each encounter with enemy aircraft a deadly game of speed, position, and marksmanship. Dick's approach remained unchanged: get close, very close, to ensure his shots connected. He compensated for what he modestly called his poor gunnery by getting so close to enemy aircraft that missing was almost impossible. This aggressive close-in shooting technique was dangerous. Dick frequently flew through the debris of exploding enemy aircraft, his P-38 pelted with fragments of metal and burning fuel. On one occasion, he actually collided with an enemy aircraft he had just brought down, the impact nearly causing his own P-38 to lose control. He claimed it as a probable victory since he wasn't certain the collision itself had caused the enemy aircraft to crash. By December 17, 1944, Dick's victory count stood at 40, a number that staggered the imagination. 40 enemy aircraft brought down, 40 aerial engagements where Dick's skill, courage, and the capabilities of his P-38 Lightning had proven superior to everything the Japanese threw at him. No American pilot had ever achieved such a total, and General Kenney decided it was time to bring Dick home before his luck ran out. On December 6, 1944, in a ceremony at Tacloban Airfield, General Douglas MacArthur personally presented Major Richard Bong with the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration for valor. As MacArthur draped the blue ribbon around Dick's neck, the general spoke words that captured what everyone was feeling. Major Richard Bong, who has ruled the air from New Guinea to the Philippines, I now induct you as a member of the soldier's highest order, the Society of the Bravest of the Brave, the wearers of the Congressional Medal of Honor of the United States. Wear it as the symbol of the invincible courage you have displayed in mortal combat. My dear boy, may a merciful God continue to protect you. 10 days later, on December 17th, Dick flew his final combat mission. He spotted a Japanese fighter over Mindoro Island and, almost on instinct, attacked and brought it down, his 40th and final victory. Then he turned his P-38, Marge's face smiling from the nose toward home, toward the airfield, toward the end of his combat career. General Kenney ordered Dick to return to the United States immediately. 40 victories was enough. Dick had done more than his share, had taken more risks than any man should have to take, and had survived when so many others had not. It was time to go home, time to marry Marge, time to start the peaceful life he had dreamed of. But even as Dick's transport plane carried him east across the Pacific, away from the war zone, history was racing toward a conclusion that no one could have predicted. The war that had consumed the world for over 5 years was entering its final terrible phase. The tragedy. Dick arrived home in January 1945 to a hero's welcome. He was instantly recognizable, his face having appeared on the covers of magazines and in newsreels shown in theaters across America. He was the ace of aces, the farm boy from Wisconsin who had become the deadliest American fighter pilot in history, and everyone wanted to meet him, shake his hand, hear his story. But Dick only wanted one thing: to marry Marge. The couple set a date for mid-February and began making plans for a small, intimate ceremony in Superior, Wisconsin. Dick would finally get to keep the promise he had made to her more than a year earlier. However, the Army Air Force had other plans for Dick. They assigned him to Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, where he would work as a test pilot for new aircraft being developed. It was supposed to be a safe posting, a way to keep the famous ace busy and useful without putting him in danger, and for several months it worked out well. Dick tested various aircraft, wrote reports on their performance, and helped engineers refine designs. Then, in June 1945, Dick received new orders. He was being transferred to Burbank, California, to work with Lockheed Aircraft Company. Lockheed was developing a revolutionary new fighter, the P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter. Dick was appointed Chief of Flight Operations and would be responsible for testing this cutting-edge aircraft. Dick was excited about the assignment. The P-80 represented the future of aviation, a fighter that used jet turbine engines instead of propellers, capable of speeds approaching 600 miles per hour. It was everything Dick loved: a new aircraft to master, new capabilities to explore, new boundaries to push. On August 6, 1945, Dick arrived at Lockheed's facility in Burbank for another test flight in the P-80. He had accumulated only about 4 hours of flight time in the jet over 12 previous flights. The aircraft was still new, still being refined, and there were quirks and issues that needed to be understood and resolved. That same morning, half a world away, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The blast instantly changed warfare forever and brought the war in the Pacific to its final apocalyptic phase. But in Burbank, California, Dick Bong knew nothing of this world-changing event. He was focused on his test flight, on the checklist he needed to complete, on the data he needed to gather. Dick climbed into the P-80's cockpit, ran through his pre-flight checks, and started the jet engine. The whine of the turbine was still strange to him after years of hearing piston engines and propellers. He taxied to the runway, received clearance from the tower, and pushed the throttle forward. The P-80 accelerated rapidly down the runway, much faster than the P-38 Dick was so familiar with. He pulled back on the stick, and the jet leaped into the air, climbing steeply. Everything seemed normal. Dick began to relax, settling into the flight, preparing to run through the test points on his list. Then, at an altitude of only a few hundred feet, something went wrong. The engine coughed, lost power. Dick's eyes snapped to the instruments. Fuel pressure was dropping. The engine was failing. Years of training and combat experience took over instantly. Dick reached for the canopy release, preparing to eject. He jettisoned the external fuel tanks, reducing weight and fire hazard, but the P-80 was too low, too slow, and losing altitude rapidly. There wasn't time. The jet nosed over and began to dive toward the ground. Dick managed to get the canopy open and tried to bail out, pulling himself out of the cockpit as the ground rushed up to meet him. But he was tangled in his parachute risers, the lines wrapped around the aircraft and around his body. He couldn't get clear. The P-80 Shooting Star impacted the ground at high speed and exploded. Major Richard Ira Bong, America's ace of aces, the farm boy from Wisconsin who had survived hundreds of combat missions and brought down 40 enemy aircraft, passed away instantly. He was 24 years old. Legacy of a legend. The news of Dick Bong's passing hit America like a physical blow. Despite the momentous news of the atomic bomb and the imminent end of the war with Japan, newspapers across the country put Dick's story on the front page. The Los Angeles Times' headline captured the nation's grief: "Ace of Aces Lost in Crash." General George Kenney, the man who had seen Dick's potential from the beginning, who had turned the clothesline incident into an opportunity rather than a disaster, was devastated. He later wrote, "You see, we not only loved him, we boasted about him. We were proud of him. That's why each of us got a lump in our throats when we read that telegram about his passing." Major Bong, ace of American aces in all our wars, is destined to hold the title for all time. With the weapons we possess today, no war of the future will last long enough for any pilot to run up 40 victories again. Marge Vattendahl, who had waited so patiently for Dick to come home, who had planned their wedding and dreamed of their future together, was heartbroken. She would later say that losing Dick was like losing part of herself. Eventually, she would move on, marry someone else, and build a good life. But she never forgot the brave pilot who had loved her from halfway around the world, whose P-38 had carried her picture into combat, whose final promise to come home had been broken not by enemy action, but by cruel fate. In Poplar, Wisconsin, the Bong family erected a memorial room in the local high school, filling it with Dick's uniform, all 26 of his decorations, photographs, newspaper clippings, and even a fragment of the P-80 in which he passed. Outside the school, they mounted a P-38 Lightning, similar to the one Dick had flown to glory, as a permanent reminder of their famous son. The Richard Bong Airport was opened in Superior, Wisconsin, honoring the hometown hero who had watched mail planes fly overhead as a boy and dreamed of one day flying himself. A state recreation area in southern Wisconsin was named for him. Bridges in Wisconsin and Australia bear his name. Streets on Air Force bases around the world are named Bong Drive or Bong Street. In 1986, Dick was posthumously inducted into the National Aviation Hall of Fame, taking his place alongside the greatest aviators in American history. But perhaps the most fitting memorial to Dick Bong is the Richard Thirst Bong Veterans Historical Center in Superior, Wisconsin. Housed in a building designed to resemble an aircraft hangar, the center contains extensive exhibits about Dick's life and career, his medals and decorations, his uniforms and flight gear, and most impressively, a restored P-38 Lightning painted to look like Marge, the aircraft that carried Dick to his record-breaking victories. The impossible made real. What made Dick Bong's achievement so remarkable wasn't just the number of victories, though 40 confirmed kills is an extraordinary total that remains the highest in American history. It wasn't just his courage, though he repeatedly flew into situations where the odds were stacked against him. And it wasn't just his skill, though his mastery of the P-38 Lightning was unmatched. What made Dick Bong legendary was how he embodied something fundamentally American, the idea that ordinary people, given the opportunity and the training, can achieve extraordinary things. Dick wasn't born into privilege. He didn't come from a military family or have connections that smoothed his path. He was a farm boy from a town of 300 people, the son of a Swedish immigrant who happened to have a gift for flying and the determination to develop that gift to its fullest potential. The impossible trick that gave this story its title wasn't any single maneuver or engagement. It was the entirety of Dick's approach to flying. From the moment he strapped into a P-38 cockpit, Dick pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible. The audacious stunts over San Francisco that should have ended his career instead caught the attention of a general who recognized that the same fearless attitude would serve Dick well in combat. The aggressive close-in shooting technique that terrified his wingmen proved devastatingly effective against enemy aircraft. The willingness to engage superior numbers to take on fights that more cautious pilots would avoid led to victory after victory. Other pilots who flew with Dick marveled at his ability to make the P-38 do things they didn't think were possible. He would dive from altitude at speeds that threatened to tear the aircraft apart, pull out at the last possible moment, and end up in perfect position behind an enemy fighter. He would roll and twist his Lightning through the sky in ways that seemed to defy physics, his twin booms flashing in the sun as he outmaneuvered more agile Japanese fighters. He flew through debris fields, collided with enemy aircraft and kept flying, survived mechanical failures and combat damage that would have ended other pilots. The Japanese pilots who faced Dick in combat came to recognize his aircraft, and many learned to avoid engaging Marge if they could. They spread stories about the American pilot who flew like a madman, who seemed impossible to hit, who always got close enough to make his shots count. He became a ghost story, a legend whispered about in ready rooms on Japanese bases, the silver P-38 with a woman's face on the nose that brought terror from the sky. But to the American pilots who flew with Dick, he was something else, an inspiration and a teacher. Dick freely shared the lessons he had learned, the tactics that worked, the techniques that could mean the difference between victory and defeat. He flew as a wingman for inexperienced pilots, protecting them during their first missions, teaching them how to survive in the lethal skies over the Pacific. He demonstrated maneuvers, explained his thinking, and never acted superior or arrogant about his success. One particular lesson Dick taught resonated throughout the 5th Air Force. During combat, Dick explained, the temptation was always to fixate on the enemy aircraft in your gun sight, to focus entirely on making the shot. But that tunnel vision could get you taken down by another enemy fighter you never saw. Instead, Dick taught pilots to constantly scan the sky, to be aware of every aircraft around them, friendly and hostile, to always know where the threats were and where safety lay. It was a lesson born from his farm upbringing, where awareness of your surroundings, of weather, of animals, of machinery, could mean the difference between a good day and disaster. Dick also taught patience. The young pilots arriving in the Pacific were eager to prove themselves, to score victories, to become aces, but Dick showed them that patience saved lives. Wait for the right setup. Don't force a shot. If the situation isn't favorable, break off and try again. The enemy aircraft would still be there tomorrow, but only if you survive today. And perhaps most importantly, Dick taught humility. Despite his record-breaking achievements, despite the medals and the newspaper headlines and the fame, Dick never forgot where he came from. He remained the farm boy from Poplar, the quiet kid who had looked up at mail planes and dreamed of flying. When younger pilots asked him for autographs or wanted to hear stories about his victories, Dick would oblige, but he always downplayed his own role. "I just got lucky," he would say. "Any of you could do the same thing with enough practice." The truth, of course, was that not everyone could do what Dick Bong did. His combination of natural talent, intensive training, fearless attitude, and deep understanding of his aircraft was rare. But by presenting himself as just a lucky farm boy, Dick gave hope to every young pilot who arrived in the Pacific scared and uncertain, wondering if they had what it took to survive. If Dick Bong could do it, they thought, then maybe they could too. The enduring impact. More than 8 decades have passed since Dick Bong flew his final mission, and the world has changed in ways that would have been unimaginable in 1945. The propeller-driven fighters of World War II have given way to supersonic jets with computers and missiles. The nature of aerial combat has transformed beyond recognition. Many of the skills that made Dick Bong successful, the close-in dogfighting and split-second marksmanship, are no longer as relevant in an age of beyond visual range missiles and electronic warfare. Yet Dick Bong's legacy endures, not because of the specific techniques he used, but because of what he represented. He showed that heroism doesn't require being the loudest person in the room, or the most outwardly confident, or someone born into the right circumstances. Dick proved that quiet determination, careful study, and humble perseverance can achieve extraordinary results. Fighter pilots today, whether they're flying F-22 Raptors or F-35 Lightnings, still study Dick Bong's tactics and career. Flight instructors use his engagements as teaching examples. The principles he demonstrated, energy management in air combat, situational awareness, teamwork, and mutual support, remain as valid today as they were over the jungles of New Guinea. The P-38 Lightning, the aircraft that Dick made famous, has its own legacy. While it struggled in the high-altitude air war over Europe, in the Pacific theater, the Lightning proved itself to be one of the finest fighters of the war. Its long range made it ideal for the vast distances of the Pacific. Its heavy firepower and rugged construction allowed it to survive damage that would have destroyed other fighters. And in the hands of skilled pilots like Dick Bong, it became a weapon of devastating effectiveness. Today, restored P-38 Lightnings appear at air shows around the country. Their distinctive twin-boom design, instantly recognizable, their twin Allison engines producing a sound that veterans of the Pacific War never forgot. When these aircraft perform, roaring past the crowd with their nose-mounted guns and that unique silhouette, spectators are reminded of the young men who flew these machines into combat, who lived and passed in them, who achieved impossible things in impossible times. But beyond the aircraft and the tactics and the historical record, what endures most powerfully is the human story at the heart of Dick Bong's legacy. It's the story of a young man who dared to dream bigger than the boundaries of his small-town upbringing. It's the story of love found in the midst of war, of promises made and tragically not kept, of a life cut short just as peace was finally within reach. It's a story that reminds us that history isn't made by faceless masses, but by individual people, with families and hopes and fears, who rise to meet extraordinary circumstances with courage and determination. When Dick Bong climbed into his P-38 for that first combat mission in December 1942, he was just another young pilot, untested and uncertain, hoping he had what it took to survive. When he climbed out of Marge for the last time in December 1944, he was the ace of aces, a legend among fighter pilots, a national hero whose name would be remembered for generations. In between those two moments lay a career of unmatched achievement, a record that has stood for more than 80 years and likely never will be broken. But more than the numbers, more than the victories and the medals and the records, Dick Bong's legacy is about the power of the human spirit to achieve the impossible. Conclusion. The mail planes that young Dick Bong watched from his family's farm in Poplar, Wisconsin, were just the beginning. They sparked a dream in a boy's heart, a dream of flying, of freedom, of seeing the world from a perspective few others would know. That dream carried Dick through training, through the transition from farm boy to fighter pilot, through hundreds of combat missions, and ultimately to his place in history as America's greatest ace. The impossible tricks Dick performed, from looping the Golden Gate Bridge to bringing down 40 enemy aircraft, were more than just displays of skill or daring. They were expressions of a fundamental belief that limitations exist to be tested, that boundaries can be pushed, that with enough determination and courage, the impossible can become possible. Every pilot who straps into a fighter aircraft, every young person who looks up at the sky and dreams of flying, every student who works hard to overcome the limitations of their circumstances, stands in the shadow of Dick Bong's legacy. His story reminds us that greatness can come from the most humble beginnings, that heroes don't need to be born, they can be made through dedication and sacrifice. In 1945, General Kenny predicted that Dick Bong's record would stand for all time, that no future war would last long enough for any pilot to match his 40 victories. So far, that prediction has proven accurate. But even if someday another pilot equals or surpasses Dick's total, the story of the farm boy from Wisconsin who became a legend will endure. Because in the end, Dick Bong's legacy isn't really about the numbers. It's about a young man who heard the call of duty and answered it with everything he had. It's about courage in the face of impossible odds. It's about loyalty to comrades and love for those waiting at home. It's about pushing beyond your limits to achieve things others said couldn't be done. The impossible trick that became Dick Bong's legend wasn't any single maneuver or victory. It was the entire arc of his life, from farm fields to fighter cockpit, from unknown kid to national hero, from dreams of flying to mastery of the sky. It was proof that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when circumstances demand it and courage allows it. And perhaps that's the most important lesson from Dick Bong's story. We all have the capacity for greatness within us. The challenges we face may not be enemy fighters over the Pacific, but they're real nonetheless. And when we face those challenges with the same determination, humility, and courage that Dick Bong showed, we honor his memory and carry forward his legacy. The boy who watched mail planes fly over his family's farm became the man who ruled the skies from New Guinea to the Philippines. The quiet, humble farm kid became America's ace of aces. The impossible became reality because one young pilot believed it could be done and then proved it day after day, mission after mission, victory after victory. That is the legend of Richard Ira Bong. That is how a farm boy's impossible trick became a story that will be told as long as people value courage, honor sacrifice, and dare to dream beyond the boundaries of their circumstances. That is how one life, lived with purpose and ended too soon, can inspire generations yet unborn. The twin boom silhouette of a P-38 Lightning, the painted face of Marge on a fighter's nose, the memory of a young man from Wisconsin who flew into history, these things endure. and they remind us all that the impossible is just waiting for someone brave enough to attempt it.